And my thoughts were short, my head 17, and she was far from me. Before summertime in northern Michigan. Splashing through the sandbar, talking about a campfire. It's the simple things in life, like when and where. We didn't have no internet, but man, I never will forget the way the moonlight shined upon her hair. And we were trying different things. We were smoking. Hey guys, make sure you sign in. Give me your name. Remember, if you want your extra credit, I need to ask a question. We're going to wait another minute or two before we start. I think I might have to move. Looks like the sun's coming the wrong way on me here. Can you hold my Chromebook with your free hand? Sun. Sun's at my back. Okay. Got to put you guys down for a second. Yeah, I'm not seeing any comments. Can you or John type a comment, see if it pops up for me? Hey guys, I'm trying to check, make sure that comments are working. Can somebody just type something in there? John, I'm not seeing comments. Can you type a comment in? All right, so it says I got 20 people. It says unable to connect to chat. Please try again. John, come here. Look on my phone. Okay. Okay, on live stream, I can see the comments. Okay. Old people and technology. Well, I hope you guys got outside, did something fun today. I got after work today, I did a little bit of home improvement. Peanut's got a brand new swing set now. Got a little chunk of flesh out, but oh well. Boo-boos happen, right? Okay, so today we're going to talk about slavery. And when we talk about slavery, we're going to kind of do it really within the context of, let's say you get a DBQ about slavery, because after all, at the end of the day, that's what you're going to get this year. You're going to get a DBQ. So those DBQ skills are the single most important thing. Okay? I sent you guys a Google slide. If you have it, I'd love it if you could open up to that sucker. It's called the Peculiar Institution. Okay? Now, let me get my comments here so I can see you guys. There we go. All right. That's weird. I can see it on the phone. Can't see it on the Chromebook. There we go. All right. That's weird. I can see it on the phone. Can't see it on the Chromebook. And I forgot to disconnect the speaker here. Hang on. Okay. So again, tonight we're going to talk about the Peculiar Institution of the South, which we just commonly know as slavery. Because if I had to try to guess about a potential DBQ topic that those College Board folks might hit you with, slavery would certainly be at the top of my list. Okay. So you have, can't see it too well here, but you've got a Google slideshow that I made for you called the Peculiar Institution. We're going to talk about documents, then I'll do questions tonight. I think it's really important that we hit documents. Now, first things first, we talk about this DBQ. you only have 45 minutes to write and you have 5 minutes to upload. So one thing I want you to consider, and I'll have a DBQ put out there on Friday for you guys, like we've been doing. You'll have the entire weekend to do it. Is first of all, if you don't like a grade, don't sweat it. When this AP test is done, I will give everybody chances to make sure that the grades are what they want to be. So don't sweat on that. You have my Mr. Esch guarantee on that. Okay, I don't want you guys getting stressed about that stuff. Again, you only have 45 minutes to write and 5 minutes to upload. Be careful how much time you spend planning. I would say the absolute most you should be spending on your planning for your DBQ is 9 minutes and 59 seconds. Okay? We want to be smart, not overdoing it when it comes to the planning aspect of stuff. Your contextualization needs to be 3 to 4 sentences, 3 to 4 real good sentences. Don't go too much more than that, guys. I love you, but some of you tend to do a ton of contextualization. 3 or 4 good sentences. Now, listen, your context has to have a couple things. One, it's got to have words in it, okay? You should never go writing a 3 or 4 sentence chunk of something without incorporating vocab words, word and bold type of things. You want to be specific. And there's 2 ways we can create context, remember. We can do the old, how did we get to this moment thing? Wayne's, and, if we are talking about slavery, say, in period 4, 1800 to 1848, then we can walk it back to colonial times. Talk about why slavery took off in the United States, in the American colonies, why it was more in certain places, more so than others. Okay. The other way you can do it, and I think the way that's most effective, is take a snapshot of the time period. So let's just say I gave you a DBQ set in let's say the status of slavery from 1780 to 1830. Okay, we know that encompasses the latter part of period 3 and the first half, we can say, of period 4. Now, what do we mean by context for that? If we're doing period 3, that's we name that time period. We call it the causes and effects of the American Revolution. So everything within period 3 is supposed to come back to that context of America becoming an independent nation. So if you're going to write about slavery, you either connect the idea that, look, the revolution in of itself caused Americans to question, slavery, question the role of who was going to be a citizen, or talk about how, slavery either contributed to the revolution and the building of the country, or again, how that factor influenced it. Period 4 is 1800 to 1848, the age of Jefferson to the age of Jackson. It's basically us as a country becoming a young republic, where we had to have questions of who could vote, what's it mean to be an American, what was our own American identity going to be, nationalism. Again, construe slavery within that context. So was slavery something that promoted nationalism? Was slavery something that created sectionalism? What role did slavery build in the creation of our national economy? And when questions of suffrage and the individual rights and the reform movements of that time period came out, what role did slavery play in that? All right, I'm looking here, and right off the get-go, got a great question from Liv. Liv wants to know, will there be a timer on the AP test? Yeah, so there's going to be a timer up on your screen. From what I remember hearing, you have the ability to X out of that timer. I am telling you, /begging you, /telling you, do not make that timer go away, because I don't know if you can actually get it back. And guys, this 45 minutes is going to fly. So you want to have that as a reference. I did a Zoom with a group of kids today. We were doing a little mini DBQ session, and I suggested either whether it's your phone or a kitchen timer is right next to your screen, have a timer set for however much time you're going to use for planning. So again, if you're going to give yourself 9 or 10 minutes to plan, I would have that timer running right there next to it. I shared early in our, quarantine refugee status here, a doc that Mrs. Kiwanis and I put together. It's an outline, just kind of like something that you could use. I'll share that to you again. An organizer, kind of like a little cheat sheet, so you can remember to talk about stuff. You might want to have that out. Worst comes to worst, just have a notebook just so you can sketch out ideas. We've been making study guides, little one-pagers. I'd like you to have those one-pagers. I was talking to a student today. He's got it all planned out, exactly how he's going to have stuff spread out at the desk he's going to take the AP test on. Okay? So that's just some stuff to think about. There's going to be an email coming out soon about like stuff you're going to have to check for prior to the test to make sure your connectivity is good, stuff like that. There's also going to be a webinar that I'm doing tomorrow night where they're going to go over some more stuff for us. All right, again, let's talk about DBQs, your thesis, the most important part of any essay. It's what you're going to build your argument off of. Remember, I want that 70-30 ratio. Okay, you're going to make your claim. The main idea, the point you feel strongest about, you're going to have your counterclaim, that 30%, the yeah, but. How do you know you have a good thesis? Well, your thesis should be one or more than one sentence. Usually it's in your intro. Some of you like to kind of like have a context paragraph and then a thesis. That's fine. But remember, your thesis needs to have that idea of a compound thought. The yeah, but. Either start your thesis with although or have that word however in the middle of it. When they say a historically defensible claim, it needs to be something that you can back up. And remember, this is a test of skills. So for essay writing, our historical thinking skills have been sourcing information from documents, making a claim, a thesis, backing up with evidence. Again, think words in bold, but also showing comparison, showing continuity and change over time, or showing causation. When you write your thesis, we've got to be able to see one of those things in your thesis. Okay? If you're writing about slavery, perhaps you're talking about, abolitionists, and you're comparing. So now on your piece of paper, you're doing a Venn diagram to give you a quick organizer. You're comparing the efforts of two different groups of abolitionists, perhaps black abolitionists and white abolitionists. Identify similarities. Well, duh, one of them is going to be abolishing slavery. But then what were their differences? Were their methods different? Did one advocate using violence? Did one advocate more direct action? And when you do the differences, do you see like which group is more successful? Outside information. Remember, you have to give me two really solid pieces of outside information, and they can't be drive-bys. You can't. A one-sentence reference is not going to give you credit. Have your higher analysis thing. We call it synthesis. Make the connection across time periods. Certainly, if you're doing slavery, you could connect the whole idea of slavery to African-American civil rights later on. I sent you guys a great link from this date in history about Muhammad Ali deciding he was not going to report for the draft as a form of civil disobedience, as a form of protest, African-American civil rights. Make sure you make that connection. And again, it can't be one sentence. When we did our last round of DBQs, for some of you guys, it was kind of like in that three, it's got to be a good like 3-4 sentences. Documents, there are 5 docs. You can use 5. You have to use at least 4. I would say don't use the 5th one unless you know you've got time and unless you really know you can knock it out of the park. Now, the other thing is when you source your documents, and this is what we're going to talk about a lot tonight, make sure you don't just tell me the purpose of a document was blah, 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 or the intended audience was blah, blah, blah. You got to tell me why it matters. So if you're going to do historical context, meaning what are the events surrounding the document, you need to explain that, look, this historical context contributed to or why the document itself was created. If you're going to do intended audience, it has to jump out in your face. Oh my gosh, this is important. Maybe it's a letter to someone asking more about slavery, and it's that particular person's important. Author's point of view, if you're going to give the point of view, you got to give some vocab behind it. We wrote that immigration DBQ the other day, and one of your documents was from Samuel Morse. And you got to hit home the idea that, look, Morse's point of view was that the rights of recent immigrants should be restricted, including suffrage rights. Morse's viewpoint was that of a nativist, and then followed up with other nativists, included groups like the Know Nothing Party. Or purpose. Some of you guys love purpose too much. You can't do purpose if you just see a chart about, what states had the most slaves. And you say, well, the purpose is to show. That doesn't help you. Purpose is only going to be useful to you guys if it's something that you can say is persuasive. For example, if a document is from a Southerner and he's saying, well, what are you going to do if you abolish slavery? What are you going to do next? Say, look, he's trying to create arguments against this. If it's the Emancipation Proclamation is your document, you could certainly say, look, one of the purpose of this document was to create a higher moral cause for the war, to reinvigorate the war effort, because the war had not gone well for the North early on. So Lincoln's trying to kind of rally people. Okay. All right. So again, do some docs, and when you get to questions, I see a bunch of questions. All right, real quick, I want to hit Allie's. Allie, how do we do contextualization if there's not a time period mentioned? All right, there more than likely is going to be a time period mentioned, Allie. In fact, there's going to be like a start date and an end date. So one, stop, pause, and say, okay, what is the time period specified in here? What are the big issues going on around there? If for some reason they do something crazy and do like a throughout American history, then do the whole thing where you say, okay, look, here's the point where the essay starts. Find something, behind it to set it up. Okay. But Allie, if I got to bet you my last dollar, I'm going to say that they're going to rock you a specific time period. They have told us that the DBQ's periods 3 through 7, which means even if they go all 5 periods, which I doubt, then you got 1 and 2 to play with. Okay. Other questions here, Jake. How did slave codes prevent slave revolt and discourage free blacks from living in the South? All right. One of the things that we can talk about tonight, the idea of slave codes. One of the biggest turning point issues, forgive me for a second, running out of my voice already. One of the big issues that's a turning point for slavery is Bacon's Rebellion. Remember, Bacon's Rebellion happens in the late 1600s in Virginia, and it was an uprising of poor whites, indentured servants, along with some free blacks. And Bacon's Rebellion kind of makes those wealthy Virginia planters realize they can't rely on indentured servitude anymore. They're going to need some other type of labor source, and that's where slavery comes in. Now, one of the results of Bacon's Rebellion was the creation of slave codes. Think the term codify means to make law. So basically, stuff like the whole idea of these slave codes was to permanently create slavery, make it something that was much harder to get out of. The term that you use is called chattel, Chattel. Remember, early on in American history, when the first slaves came to Jamestown, they were kind of quasi almost indentured servants. So now this was designed, these slave codes in colonial times, to say stuff like, look, if your children were born, they were born into slavery and they had to stay a slave, to eliminate the loopholes and the ways that slaves could get their freedom. Slave codes also tried to make very clear distinctions between the races. We did a reading from Howard Zinn way early in the year, called Drawing the Color Line. And Zinn mentioned this, the idea that if you look at it in many ways, like attitudes of racism were there created to kind of like justify and entrench slavery. The idea that, look, hey, we're protecting free whites from slaves by drawing this color line, saying that blacks could not marry whites, but also future uprisings that slaves could not carry firearms. It became illegal for slaves to learn how to read. You did a reading about the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina earlier this year, in which one of the causes was in South Carolina, they started to crack down on the underground slave economies. And they did make it much harder to have free blacks be in the South, because if you had free blacks, then that was the potential to have runaways. And there were runaway slave communities, along the frontier in the South called maroon communities. All right. We'll get back to questions in a minute. If you're following along, if you go to the end of period 2 on this little Google slide I made for you, I gave you some documents. I know you probably can't see that because of the sun. Oh, well, it's getting dark. That's a nice thing. So, first things first. If you look at an essay, try to chunk out the words and divide the essay up. And we're going to do this on a Zoom meeting Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. I sent you guys an invite. But let's say you had a DBQ that said something like, assess the manner in which American slavery evolved due to economic and social changes in the United States. And they gave you a time period of 1800 to 1850. You want to chunk that out on a piece of paper. Okay? So if we're talking about change, automatically you know it's a continuity and change over time essay. So on your little piece of paper, draw continuity, draw change. And then they've given you economic, they've given you social. So you kind of create a little grid. And then that gives you something to help set your boxes up. And again, we're going to do this on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. So if you get a document like the one you see, hopefully, on your Google slide for period 2, I gave you excerpts from the Virginia slave codes. Okay, the first one says Virginia 1639. All persons except Negroes are to be provided with arms and ammunitions or to be fined at the pleasure of the governor and council. In other words, every person has to have firearms except for blacks. And if they don't, they'll be fined. Okay? Maryland, 1664. That whatsoever freeborn Englishwoman shall intermarry with any slave shall serve the master of such slave during the life of her husband, and that all the issue of such freeborn women so married shall be slaves as their fathers were. In other words, if a freeborn white woman married a slave, then she would basically have to serve that slave's master as long as that slave was alive, and any children they had would automatically have slave status. Okay? Virginia 1667. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth should by virtue of their baptism be made free, it is enacted that baptism does not alter the condition to the person as to his bondage or freedom. In other words, there had been questions that, well, what if you're baptized a Christian? Does that get you out? That was something that in Spain, if you became a Christian, you couldn't be a slave. And in Virginia in 1667, boom, they put the hammer down and said, no, that does not get you out of slavery. And then there's one more from Virginia in 1682. It is enacted that all servants which shall be imported into this country, either by sea or land, whether they're Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, or Indians, if they are not Christian at the time of their first purchase, that they will be decreed to be slaves and nothing contrary to it. Basically, what these are doing is, if you look at the time period on those docs, hopefully you're following along, you see an evolution from 1639 to 1682, codifying slavery. That first excerpt from Virginia, the purpose of it is to try to control any African slaves in 1639. Within 20 years, the first slaves come in there by saying they can't carry firearms, but everybody else must, as a means to protect the colony, maybe from Indian attack, but also maybe it's from slave uprisings. In Maryland in 1664, to discourage intermarrying, if a white woman marries a slave, she basically becomes a servant. You could talk about historical context, how Bacon's Rebellion, again, happens in like 1670, and how that becomes the big factor that kind of really speeds up this need to, or at least the desire to create, a more solidified slave status. For contextualization, you could also talk about how tobacco became more and more of a booming crop. I gave you documents from Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake colonies, and tobacco was the big cash crop there. All right, I gave you an excerpt, more documents from period 2, called William Byrd's Diary. Now, William Byrd is a dude we read earlier this year, documents by him. He is a very, very wealthy plantation owner. So here's the documents. It's his diary, February 8th, 1709. I rose at 5 o'clock this morning and read a chapter in Hebrew and 200 verses in Homer's Odyssey. I ate milk for breakfast. I said my prayers. Jenny and Eugene were whipped. I danced my dance. I read law in the morning and Italian in the afternoon. February, we'll skip all the way down to September 3rd, 1709. I read some geometry. We had no court this day. My wife was indisposed again, but not so much to purpose. I ate roast chicken for dinner. It's a boring day. In the afternoon, I beat Jenny for throwing water on the couch. So he just gives these diary entries. There's 5 of them in there. I ate this. I did that. It's a boring day. Oh, I whipped this slave. I beat this slave. So now, historical circumstances. I don't know if you're going to be able to pull something like that off from 1709, but intended audience, not so much, but certainly you could do point of view perspective. This is the point of view of a slave owner who so little values the humanity of his slaves that it's nothing to him. He just kind of rattles off, oh, I did this, I ate that. Oh, by the way, I horribly whipped or beat a slave. Yeah, and I did this and I did that. Oh, and today I did this or that. Okay, so you could certainly kind of go with a point of view type of thing. Last one, document for slavery in period 2. And again, I hope you're able to follow along with my Google slide. It's from South Carolina, the South Carolina Gazette, which is a newspaper, October 28th, 1732. And it's a notice in this newspaper. Run away from his master's plantation in the parish of St. James's Goose Creek, a lusty Negro man named Hercules. He formerly used to wait on his master in Charleston and is now by trade a cooper, meaning a barrel maker. He had on when he went away a blue duffel's jacket, a pair of Ozenbridge breeches, and speaks very good English. Whoever apprehends and brings him either to the said plantation in Goose Creek or to his master, robbing him on Charleston Neck, shall receive a £5 reward, besides the usual allowance for mileage. Another one of these notices in 1737. Run away from the plantation of Isaac Porter on Wassama, a new Angola Negro man named Claus. He's a small fellow. There is an abundance of Negroes in the province of this area. He may be harbored among some of them, meaning he may be in a place that's a maroon community. Therefore, all masters who desire to give notice of their slaves shall receive the same reward if they take up the said runaway. In other words, I'll give a reward to anybody who's willing to go get this runaway because of this maroon community. So again, historical circumstances. Well, it's South Carolina in 1739 or 1735. You're going to get the Stono Rebellion. But really, again, I think you could say intended audience, because he's taking out an ad to the whole colony saying, look, I'd like help in recapturing my slave. We want to keep the status quo. You could certainly see intended audience here. You could see point of view. But now tie it back into what's the purpose of your essay. If your essay is discussing how the status of slavery has changed, and you've seen the Virginia slave codes, and you've seen these notices from South Carolina, you see that slavery has become more and more of an economic commodity with a higher value, and that to Southerners, they were less and less likely to part ways with slaves. If you skip ahead to period 3, there's documents at the end of there. You're going to find a map. And the map is entitled Early Emancipation in the North from 1777 to 1804. And it shows how slavery was abolished in some northern states. It shows you the Northwest Territory. And it says in the map, the Northwest Territory's got lines that go diagonally. Slavery was prohibited by the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. It shows by state constitution how Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, through their state constitutions, abolished slavery. And then it showed by state law with the idea of gradual emancipation. New York in 1799 passed a law that said, look, the children of these slaves will be emancipated. And the date finally took until 1827 in New York. Okay? So you see that. What do you see from this document? You see that different areas in the North got rid of slavery in different ways. That the Northwest Territory was never even allowed to have slavery because of the Northwest Ordinance, which was an act of Congress that forbid it. You see that the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Rhode Island passed state laws that kind of gradually phased out slavery in the North. In fact, New York was the last state, unfortunately, to phase out slavery in the North. Other states like Vermont, Massachusetts had state constitutional amendments made. Now, you're not going to get much for intended audience with this. Okay. Again, intended audience is only a good sourcing skill if you can look at the person who it's for and go, oh my gosh, I know that guy. You know, if someone writes a letter to George Washington, you go, oh, George Washington. Okay, that's why it's important. there's no point of view. It's a map. If you get maps or charts or graphs, don't go telling me this is the point of view of something. Don't go tell me the intended audience for that. What you can get, though, is you can get historical context. This goes from 1777 to 1804, which means it goes through the second half of period 3. 1777 is during the American Revolution. 1804 takes you all the way up through right a year after the Louisiana Purchase. When we're a young republic, we're trying to address our own issues about what it means to be a republic, about who's going to be allowed to participate in our democracy. You could, during the same time period, the Constitution was ratified, and the Constitution had a clause in it that said we would not even discuss the future of the slave trade until 1808. Why does that matter? Because our founding fathers, A, were kind of putting off the crisis, but B, they were also kind of sitting there kind of going, well, you know what? Maybe by then it'll work itself out. You could also draw some inferences when you source this document and say, look, historical context, you don't see this in the North, in the South, I mean. Why? Well, in the 1790s, some guy named Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which all of a sudden makes it easier to process cotton, which means the demand for cotton production increases, and slavery becomes even more valuable. Again, it's during the time of the Constitution. And you could mention how this issue of slavery, although progress was made in the North, it was still unresolved, as evidenced by the fact that at this same time, in 1787, the Three-Fifths Compromise was created, because you still had southern states that not only used slavery for an economic asset, but because it counted more as population for them, they were able to have a political gain from it too. Moving on here. All right. You've got another document from period 3. Benjamin Rush. And it says a prominent white Philadelphia physician and reformer, and it's a letter of introduction for the Reverend Mr. Gloucester. The bearer of this letter, Reverend Mr. Gloucester, is an African-American ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church. He visits your town in order to obtain pecuniary aid, meaning financial aid, to help him purchase the freedom of his wife and his children, for which the extravagant sum of $1,500 has been demanded by their master and the mistress. The Friends of Religion and of the Poor Africans in Philadelphia have sent $500 to them for that purpose. At present, he preaches to crowds of his African brethren in a schoolhouse every Sunday. All right, so what are we getting here? One, this is a guy in 1810 in Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush. He's one of the leaders in the American Revolution, who's writing a letter of reference, basically, for an African-American minister. We can get out of this that there were black churches. One of the results of the revolution was you had the creation of black churches. You can see that in some northern areas, there was an effort made by people like Benjamin Rush to help African Americans purchase their freedom. This man in particular, he had the ability to do that. By present the census, it appears that blacks in our city will amount to more than 2,000 souls. Their late great increase is from migration from the southern states. Again, the idea that free blacks are moving up north. So you could say, look, author's point of view, Rush, he's a physician. It calls him a reformer. You might remember Benjamin Rush from the American Revolution. So this is a person who is reform-minded, who wants to help African Americans. And again, maybe because of the American Revolution and those ideals of all men are created equal in the Declaration, he's saying, look, we have to do something to help against slavery. You could talk about the historical context. Again, this is post-revolution, and in northern states, we just said in Pennsylvania, slavery was abolished gradually by a law that was passed in 1780. So maybe Benjamin Rush is trying to help this man gain the freedom of his family before the quote gradual time. All right, where we see slavery the most, though, is period 4 and period 5, because we get heated up. Now, do you remember that word sectionalism? The idea that our country was being divided up. We see sectionalism more and more and more. All right. If you would, please take a look at the first document there. And this is from the American Colonization Society. If you have this Google slide opened up, and I hope you do, please just take a second and read over the document. Got to turn my outdoor heater on here. beautiful day, but getting a little bit chilly. All right. So you have a document from the American Colonization Society. It was a petition presented to Congress on February 2nd, 1820. So now you might remember the ACS, the American Colonization Society. I put them in this Google slide for you. The American Colonization Society was one of the earliest abolitionist societies. Their methods of abolishing slavery were different, though. They wanted to purchase the freedom of slaves. They tried to compensate slave owners. They said, look, we're not asking for slavery to be abolished and just automatically take them away, but rather kind of like persuade people to do it through financial means. The ACS also advocated the idea of repatriation, moving blacks back to Africa, with the idea that once you freed slaves, you then had a problem that you had to deal with. You can't have a landless class of people with nothing and nowhere to go. So their solution was, let's help them move back to Africa. So the American Colonization Society actually helped create a new country in Africa. It's still around today. We call it Liberia. And the capital of Liberia today still is named after the most famous member of the American Colonization Society. It's called Monrovia, after James Monroe. All right, so here's the document. The last census shows the number of free people of color in the U.S. and their rapid increase. The least observation shows that this description of persons are not and cannot be either useful or happy among us. They're describing these free blacks. They cannot be useful or happy among us. And many considerations, which need not be mentioned, prove beyond dispute that it is best for all parties interested that there should be a separation. In other words, they're trying to make a case to Congress saying, look, the number of free blacks has increased dramatically, and everybody knows the best thing to do is help them go back. We cannot believe that such an evil, universally acknowledged and deprecated, has been irremovably fixed upon us. In other words, we cannot believe that something as awful and evil as slavery can't be undone. Some way will always be opened by Providence by which a people desirous of acting justly and benevolently may be led to the attainment of a meritorious object. And we believe that the colonization of Africa in the manner proposed presents the fairest prospects of success. All right, so if I have to do sourcing of this document, I could certainly say historical circumstances. This is 1820. We are in period 4. It's the age of Jefferson. It's the age of Jackson. It's just right at the beginning of those antebellum reform movements. And one of the big reform movements that'll get touched on in the antebellum period is slavery. It's also 1820, the same year as the Missouri Compromise, the big congressional act that had to try to resolve the question of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase. 1820, it's after the War of 1812, when Americans are trying to be nationalistic. We're in the so-called era of good feelings, but in reality, the country's getting divided more and more between North and South. You could do intended audience because the intended audience is Congress. So by sending a petition to Congress, you can tell the American Colonization Society is expecting Congress to act. They perhaps are looking for funds to move newly freed slaves back to Africa. Maybe they're trying to get Congress to pass some type of legislation to call for there's the ACS, so that's the gradual, not automatically, but the ACS might advocate things like, make it so that slaves will be freed after X amount of time and that their children would be freed. The gradual and the compensated. We're going to pay slave owners to free their slaves. Okay? You could say, point of view, that these are early abolitionists, that they're probably more likely white abolitionists, that they are not as radical as other abolitionists who come along later on, like William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, who founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, and his big thing was immediate emancipation of the slaves, uncompensated, don't pay a dime, that slavery was a moral wrong and that had to be condemned, that's wicked, and don't do anything for anybody. Okay? Purpose, they're trying to get support from Congress for the repatriation of slaves. Okay? All right. Next document, William Lloyd Garrison, Declaration of Sentiments of the American Anti-Slavery Society. With entire confidence in the overruling justice of God, we plant ourselves upon the Declaration of Independence and upon the truths of divine revelation. Now, Garrison's an abolitionist. Garrison believed in what was called moral suasion. So if we're going to talk about point of view of the author, again, Garrison, as an abolitionist, believes that slavery is an evil, it's wicked, it's morally wrong, and that the way you end slavery was to morally convince people, again, this term moral suasion, that slavery was a sin and had to be abolished. If you look at that document, you can tell that Harrison's point of view is that of an abolitionist. But again, remember, he's a part of the American Anti-Slavery Society. They are not the Colonization Society. They don't advocate stuff like moving blacks back to Africa, and they're not going to be supporters of compensating slave owners. All right. We shall organize anti-slavery societies, if possible, in every city, town, and village of our land. We shall send forth agents to lift up the voice of remonstrance, of warning, of entreaty. Okay, in other words, we're going to send people who are going to preach against slavery. We will do all that in us lies with the Declaration of Independence to get rid of, deliver from our land its deadliest curse. Okay? You could do historical context. This is written in 1833. This is written during the Second Great Awakening. And we learned so much about the Second Great Awakening. Explain how it's Protestant evangelicism, how it leads to all kinds of different reform movements. And that one of the biggest ones was abolition. All right. Next document 4. I've got Angelina Grimke, An Appeal to the Christian Women of the South. 1836. So again, it's during the Second Great Awakening, where you have this Protestant evangelicism, you have all these different reforms. You could mention the fact that Angelina Grimke, she's a prominent woman. She speaks for women's rights. If you know anything about her, she and her sister Sarah wrote stuff for women's rights. They're both abolitionists, but they're also Southerners. They're from South Carolina. And you know how this shows relevance. You could talk about historical context, how again, during this time period, women were active in all kinds of reforms, and connect that to the cult of domesticity with the idea that women were told it's their duty to protect the morality of their children, and therefore things that were sinful, like slavery, had to be dealt with. All right. Last time period for tonight, we have period 5. I gave you an excerpt from David Wilmot. Okay, it's 1847. I make no war upon the South, nor upon slavery in the South. I have no squeamish sensitiveness upon the subject of slavery. I plead the cause of the rights of white freemen. So, if you look at this right away, it's David Wilmot. Hopefully, you remember the Wilmot Proviso. So, Wilmot's a member of Congress from the North. He's the guy who got put into a Mexican War spending bill a clause that said slavery would not be allowed in any territory taken from Mexico. That provision, the Wilmot Proviso, was eventually taken out, but it caused national controversy. It's 1847. It's during the Mexican War. Talk about that as the context of your document, because the war created so much of a dispute and controversy over the question of slavery. All right, I see so many questions here. I want to make sure we get to them. So we'll take a break from the docs. I think you got the idea where we're going here. You need to make sure whatever part of, H, I, P, or P you do, that you connect it back to your thesis and explain it. Brandon, did the slave situation in the U.S. have any effect on the country's relationships with other nations who had long abolished it? We don't really talk about that, Brandon, until you get to two things. One, it's the reason why Texas declares their independence from Mexico. Despite the Disneyfied version of it, they're fighting for freedom. Well, they're kind of fighting for their freedom for slavery. Americans who moved west to Texas into what was Mexican territory, they were violating the Mexican Constitution when they were bringing slaves with them. But the other big thing you talk about is when you get to period 5, it's one of the reasons why the North wins the Civil War. One of Lincoln's biggest fears was that all of a sudden Great Britain would get involved in the Civil War, either actually militarily or at least in terms of recognition by the South. In fact, the South's whole strategy was hang on until we can get the British to recognize us. They called it cotton diplomacy. Okay. And one of the reasons, and this is where you can score some nice analytical points, one of the reasons for the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln knew it'd be a way to keep the British out. When Lincoln all of a sudden says, hey, I'm freeing slaves in areas that are in rebellion. Now he's literally changing the moral focus of the war. He changes things from preserve the Union to we're fighting to abolish slavery. And by doing so, not only does he energize the population of the North, he also kind of flips the bird to the British and goes, I dare you. I dare you to get involved. Helena, how did the American Revolution influence abolitionism? You could really say, Helena, that what it does is it kind of starts the earliest movements of it. Now, again, no traction in the South, but let's talk about this. In 1790, 91, there's a petition written up by Quakers from Pennsylvania. It's brought to the House of Representatives. It caused a humongous controversy in the House because the biggest signature on it was Ben Franklin's. It leads to the creation of the first abolitionist societies. It brings up this question of, the status of slavery. Again, you see Massachusetts, you see Vermont, where they have in their state constitutions provisions to abolish slavery. And it kind of goes back to the whole idea of the revolution. How can we say all men are created equal if we have slavery? It goes back to like the Lord Dunmore Proclamation in Virginia, where the royal governor of Virginia, to help King George, said, look, any slave who fights for his majesty, you'll get your freedom. Abby, what was the West's view on slavery? Were many like Lincoln before the Civil War with just wanting to contain it? It depends. Southerners wanted to move slavery out west, Abby, with the idea that it had to grow, that if it didn't grow, slavery would die. Could you plant cotton in areas that now are New Mexico? In some of the river valleys, yes. Could slaves perhaps do mining in some areas out in Arizona or New Mexico? Yeah. But the idea more was you needed slave states to increase because remember, you get 2 senators per state. And the South, as we went on closer and closer towards the Civil War, was so outnumbered in terms of population, they had to do something. So by creating new, hopefully for them, slave states, it would allow them to equal up representation. Northerners, though, they start pushing out west, and those are the free soilers. And yes, the free soiler movement was really big. A lot of people had Lincoln's attitude of, look, we're not even talking about slavery in the South. More, we just don't want it to spread. Some kind of took a racist attitude towards it. They thought slavery degraded the value of white labor. Some, especially Illinois had a lot of racism. In Illinois, they actually passed laws to try to keep free blacks out. So it was a matter of not just keep slavery out. They didn't want to bring blacks into the Western states. They thought for economic terms, how could you compete with slave labor? Let's see here. Logan, following the ratification of the 15th Amendment, what were some ways Southern states prohibited African Americans from voting? All right, you got the big 3, Logan. You've got literacy tests where on demand, any polling official, any local official at a voting place could say, you need to prove that you're literate. We only want literate people to vote. And the standards of literacy were different. If you were white, it might be, write your name. It might be write a sentence. If you're black, it might be, here's a copy of the Constitution, explain everything to us. The poll tax, the idea that you had to pay a tax to vote. Well, especially during Reconstruction, who were the poorest people in the South? Free blacks. But don't worry, if you could not pay the poll tax or you couldn't pass the literacy test, you also had grandfather clauses, meaning your grandfather did. If you were eligible to vote before 1868, then you could still vote. Well, what group of people couldn't vote before 1868? African Americans, which, by the way, was before the 15th Amendment. Katie, which documents about slavery are the most important to talk about in the DBQ? Oy, okay, Katie, here's the deal. If you've got documents for slavery, big ones, Missouri Compromise of 1820, anything about the Compromise of 1850, anything about the Fugitive Slave Act, I'd say of all the ones, that's probably the biggest. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, anything by an abolitionist, especially, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, excerpts from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's see here. Rob, did the Seneca Falls Convention address anything regarding slavery? Rob, I do not remember off the top of my head if it was addressed because, again, it was a women's rights issue, but if it didn't overtly, it did indirectly because one of the most prominent speakers at Seneca Falls was Frederick Douglass. the famous African-American abolitionist. Frederick Douglass was a runaway slave. And Douglass was also a person who spoke on the issue of women's rights. Why? Because he saw a very powerful ally to help the cause of abolition in white women. Remember, prior to the 14th and 15th Amendment, abolitionists and women suffragists, they kind of work together like this. Now, all of a sudden, when the 14th Amendment gives black men citizenship and the 15th gives black men the right to vote, that's when all of a sudden you see, women's suffrage leaders get a lot more militant. Jordan, if so, who was for and was against? Jordan, I'll try to see if I can figure out what you mean by that. Anna, songs. What songs could we use for synthesis? Okay. If you want to use any songs for slavery, the best one is there's a one called Follow the Drinking Gourd. I took a grad class about the Underground Railroad. There was a song, I think I played it for you this year, called Follow the Drinking Gourd. What's the drinking gourd? A drinking gourd would be like something that, you would take a sip from. Imagine like a big scoop or a big dipper. Because what does the Big Dipper point to? The North Star, which lets you navigate and helps you get to freedom. So you could certainly connect that, Anna, Follow the Drinking Gourd, to other civil rights songs, stuff like that. Faith, could you use encomienda as synthesis to get that extra analytical point? You absolutely could. You could argue that, look, the question of forced labor goes back to the earliest parts of American history, that the Spanish had the system of encomienda, where Indians were forced to work in the fields, work in mines for the Spanish, under the excuse that, we're giving them a Catholic education. You could also point out the fact that European diseases killed off native populations, especially smallpox, and because this happened, it led to having to replace that labor source, which led to the importation of slaves. Faith, absolutely could. It'd be great if you did that. Matt, were there specific smaller regions in the South that went against the ideas of slavery? I would not say went against, but Matt, think of it this way. There were regions in the South that had less of a reliance on slavery, the Upper South in particular. So if you look at 1861, in December of 1860 into 1861, when the Southern states seceded, the first states to leave the Union, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the deepest parts of the South. They're also what we called the Cotton Belt. They had the highest density of slaves in the South. The last four states to leave the Union, Tennessee, Arkansas, hi James, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, and except for Virginia, but North Carolina, Tennessee especially, less density of slaves. The border states, you had states that did not secede from the Union, but still had slavery. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri. Now, why do they have less density of slaves? Economic factors. Slavery wasn't as profitable, perhaps, but you could say that there were different stages of slavery. Let's see here. Gino, what effects did Uncle Tom's Cabin have on the attitude towards slavery? Oh, great one. So if you're going to write about slavery or you're writing about women's rights, Uncle Tom's Cabin lets you do either one because it brings in everything. It's important because of the cult of domesticity. Harriet Beecher Stowe's a housewife. Harriet Beecher Stowe's writing a morality tale, and one of the big themes of the book is that slavery destroys families, both white and black. You can bring in the Second Great Awakening because Stowe, the whole book is a Jesus metaphor. Tom is Jesus in the book. He's killed at the end where he's held with his arms outstretched, and right before he dies, he forgives everybody. Okay? And Lincoln, during the Civil War, supposedly met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, so you're the little lady who started the big war. Let's see here. Gianna wants to know what slave rebellion was most important. Oh my gosh. It's not so much what's most important, it's what do you know? All right, in colonial times, Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina is a good one, but again, that could be more for like your contextualization, your synthesis, because it's outside the time period for the DBQ. In period 4, you had Denmark Vesey, you had Gabriel Prosser. The easiest one, if you want, would be Nat Turner in Virginia. That's 1829, 1830. I think I hyperlinked that in the Google slide, Gianna. Also, you could try John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. That's another really good one to know. Let's see here. Marissa, synthesis between Nat Turner's Rebellion and the Stone Rebellion. That's a great connection. If you're talking about slave rebellions and you go way back into period 2 to the Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina in the 1730s, yes, Marissa, that would be a great connection. Jake, we did you to start. And Bennett, did abolition ever spread into the South? Notable figures, if there were. Yes, the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke. In fact, one of the Grimke sisters, forgive me because I'm old, but one of the Grimke sisters married an African-American man, kind of caused like a big scandal because of that. But not widespread. Now, you could also point out, though, that the majority of people in the South did not, in fact, own slaves. Only about like 25% of the people in the South actually owned slaves. Why? Slaves were expensive. And to own slaves, to make it profitable, you had to have a lot of land. Remember, you had people who were like incredibly big landowners like Thomas Jefferson, and you had like a lot more poor whites. And that the majority of people who did own slaves owned like 10 or fewer. The idea like the monstrous plantations, like that's a Thomas Jefferson. That's the ultra rich kind of thing. And I think that's what we got for tonight, guys. We're going to stop about 2 minutes short of the 1 hour mark here. Anybody have any other questions? I'll pause for a second, grab a quick sip here. If you have another question, give it to me. Otherwise, again, Thursday, 10 a.m., I sent you an invite. If you're interested, Zoom. I think the people who did it today liked what we did. And if not, tell me and I'll do an even better job. Waiting one more minute because I know there's like a little bit of a lag between when I talk and when you guys do something. All right. Hey, I'll see you Thursday. There will be a DBQ for you guys to write over the weekend. I'll put it up there on Friday. You have until the end of the day Sunday. You're doing a good job getting your work done on with Test Wizard and getting in that 45-minute time period. But please give me requests. If you want it, I'll do it. One thing that was brought up today was play a synthesis game. So I think we'll do a game next time. And it's something we can actually do on YouTube Live because you guys can answer in the comments. So I'm thinking next week that we'll try to start doing some games because usually if I do these review classes in person, we've got all kinds of crazy games going on. And it's a little bit harder. Otherwise, log off, plug in your Chromies, homies, and I'll see you soon.